We say we sell creative thinking. We build entire reputations around it. We write it on agency websites. We celebrate it in awards speeches. And yet, at some point in your career, if you are creative, you realize this. If creativity is the product, why does it lose authority the moment money enters the room? Welcome to the Unspoken Yes, the podcast where we talk about advertising while quietly wondering what would happen if the people making the ideas were also allowed to run the place. Today, we're going to explore a slightly embarrassing question. If creativity is the product agencies sell, why is it so rare to see creative leaders running the business? Before anyone gets defensive, this episode isn't about complaining. It's about naming a contradiction. Because agencies exist to sell creativity, the thing that's supposed to make one agency different from another. The reason clients choose one partner over the dozens of others pitching the same brief. But when it comes to choose who runs the agency, creativity suddenly becomes much less important. And that raises an interesting question. Is it because creatives can run business? Or because the industry has quietly decided it doesn't want them to? Now, the honest answer is probably somewhere in the middle. Because agencies aren't the only ones responsible for this situation, to be honest. Creatives themselves have played their part too. But before we get there, and before we get fighting, we need to look at the story the industry likes to tell about this problem. See, the industry has a very convenient explanation for this. Creatives aren't business people. As simple as that. Apparently, we're too emotional, we're too chaotic, too attached to our ideas, and obviously famously terrible with numbers.
No shit, Sherlock.
Which, if you think about it, is fascinating, to be honest, considering most creatives spend their days calculating how many hours of their lives they're about to lose to the client's latest round of feedback. But jokes aside, the story goes like this. Creatives are great at ideas, but running a business requires a completely different skill set. Requires structure, financial discipline, operational thinking, all serious adult stuff. And because creatives supposedly lack those skills, leadership roles naturally go to people who are closer to the business. Now, at first glance, that sounds reasonable, until you look at what creative leaders actually do inside agencies. Because most senior creatives already run teams. They manage pressure. They make decisions with incomplete information every single day. They also handle conflict. They take responsibility when ideas fail. And they operate in ambiguity on a daily basis. Which, interestingly enough, is also what leadership looks like. So maybe the problem isn't capability. Maybe the problem is just perception. Creative thinking is celebrated as output, but distrusted as governance. I didn't fully understand this dynamic until I started getting closer to the other side of the table. The first time it happened was when I joined a smaller, young agency that wasn't born from the traditional advertising experience. There was no traditional agency training, no classic structure, just instinct, ambition, and a lot of trial and error, which created a very unusual environment where the borders between departments were, let's say, flexible. Production reported to creative. Creative dealt directly with clients. Just two examples. And suddenly, I was making decisions that had nothing to do with taglines or layouts, but everything to do with whether the project could actually happen. At the time, I disagreed a lot with that. Honestly, I still do. But that lack of traditional agency thinking had one unexpected consequence. It exposed me to the machinery behind the work much earlier than most creatives ever see. Suddenly, the things we usually complain about from the outside were happening right in front of me. Hiring decisions, budget constraints, client pressure, all the invisible stuff shaping the work before the creative conversation even started. Then, a few years later, something similar happened again, but in a completely different way. I was leading the creative and production teams of the agency while the business lead was based in another country, which meant that day to day I was the most senior person in the office. So slowly, I started sitting in conversations that had nothing to do with ideas anymore. I'm talking about HR discussions, headcount planning, salary budgets, conversations with finance, resource allocations across teams, and that's when something clicked. For most of our careers as creatives, we complain about the business side of the industry. We complain about the client. We also complain about the strategy, about the brief, about the account team, about the people not getting the work. And the truth is, most of the time, we complain because we don't actually see the full picture. Then, one day, you end up on the other side of that table, and suddenly the situation becomes annoyingly reasonable, not easy, and obviously not always fair, but understandable in a way. Because you realize something most creatives never experience directly. Creative decisions with their business consequences and business decisions always landing on the work. Both are tangled in a very complicated way. So there you are, holding the gun on both fronts, defending the work to the client and defending the business to the team. And let me tell you this, it's not a comfortable place to be. But it's also where something interesting happens. You realize creativity and business aren't enemies. They're just two forces constantly negotiating with each other.
Oh, look, an eagle!
Sometimes creativity has to give. Sometimes business has to give. The thing is that if the same person understands both sides of that tension, the work actually gets better. Now, here's the other side of this conversation. Because once you've sat at the adults' table for a while, another question starts to appear. If understanding the business makes the work better, why don't more creatives want to be there? And the plain answer is that sometimes we just don't. Not because creatives are incapable of running businesses, but because a lot of creatives never wanted that responsibility in the first place. They wanted to play. They wanted to make things. They wanted to have opinions about the work without having to worry about the payroll, the margins, the hiring freezes, or whether the agency will still exist in 12 months. Which, by the way, is completely understandable. Look at it this way. The creative department is one of the last places in the business where people are still paid to imagine things, to be kids forever. And if we're being honest, there's a bit of a Peter Pan syndrome in our industry. A lot of creatives want the freedom of the playground without the responsibility of running the school. That doesn't mean they're lazy or incapable. It just means they choose the part of the job they love the most. Who wouldn't want a job where you get to think, you get to question things, you get to obsess over ideas that might never exist? And the moment you move too far up the ladder, a lot of that disappears. You go from protecting the idea one day to protecting the company the next one. So, hey, a lot of creative leaders make a very rational decision. They stay close to the work, opting out of the part where someone has to run the machine. Which means something interesting happens inside agencies. The people responsible for the work aren't always the people responsible for the business. And once that gap exists, it becomes very easy for both sides to misunderstand each other. Creatives think the business side doesn't care about ideas. Say no. The business side thinks creatives don't understand reality. And both sides are a little bit right. Even if all that's true, there's still a question hanging in the air. Because if creatives sometimes choose not to run agencies, that still doesn't explain why the industry so rarely trusts them to do it. And that's where things get interesting. Because agencies love creative thinking. They celebrate it, they award it, and they build their entire marketing narrative around it. But hey, when it comes to running the business, suddenly creativity becomes a risk. It's too unpredictable, too emotional, too difficult to control in front of clients. And if you think about it, from a traditional agency perspective, that fear is not entirely irrational, eh? Creative people are unpredictable.
How did these get up here?
We fall in love with the ideas, we challenge things that everyone else already agreed on. We bring tension into rooms where the business would much rather keep things smooth. Which means that putting a creative person in charge doesn't just change the work. It changes the conversations or the priorities. It changes the power dynamics inside the agency. And maybe that's the real issue here. Maybe agencies don't avoid creative leaders. Maybe they avoid creative leadership. Because creative leadership doesn't just produce ideas. It questions processes. It challenges comfortable decisions. It forces organizations to confront things they would often prefer to keep quiet, especially in large agency networks designed to reduce risk, not to introduce more of it. Which might explain another interesting thing happening in the industry right now. Because if you look closely at where creative leadership actually survives, it's rarely inside the biggest structures. And that's not an accident. Which raises a slightly uncomfortable question for the big networks, to be honest. If creativity is the product, what kind of leadership should be running the company that sells it?
I'm in the front seat.
And this brings us to an interesting moment for the industry. Because if you listen to the conversations happening right now, there's a phrase that keeps coming up time and again. The future is small, independent, and fast. After every big merger or consolidation wave, the same idea returns, that the agencies best positioned to adapt to clients today aren't the biggest ones. They are the smaller, more flexible ones. The ones where decisions move faster, where structure is lighter, and where the people shaping the work are often the same people shaping the business. And if you look closely, there's another pattern hiding inside that. Many of the agencies that punch above their weight creatively are run by people who came from the creative side of the industry. Look at places like GUT, Uncommon Studios, Special Group, or even Mischief. Different cultures, different models. But in all of them, the creative voice sits very close to the center of the business, which suggests something interesting. It's not that creative leadership disappears inside large agency structures, but smaller independent shops tend to organize themselves around it, places where ideas aren't just the product, but part of how the company itself is run. And if that's true, then the question for the large agency networks becomes unavoidable. Because the future of this industry won't be decided by who has the biggest structure. I think that we all know that. It will be decided by who can still create the most valuable ideas in a more agile way. So the real question is not whether creatives should run agencies. The real question is whether agencies are ready for leaders who think creatively about the business itself. And the answer to that question doesn't only depend on agency owners, to be honest. It also depends on creatives. Because if creative leaders want to sit at the adult table, at some point they have to stop standing near the playground. Maybe the most interesting part of this conversation is that it might not even be about personalities, right? It might be about timing. Advertising agencies were built in a moment when the business was relatively stable. Clients moved slower, media moved slower, and the job of leadership itself was mostly about managing a system that already worked. But the industry we are in today looks slightly different. The rules keep changing, the platforms keep changing, the way brands grow keeps changing. Which means agencies are no longer just managing a machine, they're constantly redesigning it. And if that's the case, then the real question might not be whether creatives should run agencies. The real question might be whether the leadership models agencies were built on still make sense for the kind of industry we're moving into. Because if the future of this business depends on people who can navigate uncertainty, hey, creatives might not be the risky choice everyone assumes. They might actually be the obvious one. Anyway, that's today's thought experiment. If you work in this industry, you probably have your own opinion about this. Maybe you think creative leaders should absolutely run agencies. Or maybe you think that would be a complete disaster. Or maybe you're somewhere in the middle, which is where most interesting conversations usually live. Either way, if this episode made you look at the industry a little differently, share it with someone you work with. Ideally, someone who sits on the other side of the table. Those are usually the best conversations. And if you ever feel like continuing this chat, you can always write to me at theunspokenyes@gmail.com. I read every message you send. Sometimes it turns into a reply, and sometimes it turns into a future episode. Who knows? Either way, we'll take it from there. And by the way, if you want more conversations like this one, you know where to find the Unspoken Yes. See you in the next episode. And don't forget to take care of the work and, of course, take care of yourself too.
I'm in the front seat. I run the show. When I accelerate, I'm so loud. And I won't stay in my lane.